Oh, we're about a few minutes past 7, so good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 12th of our online talks for the Contemporary Group. This evening, I'm very pleased to welcome Richard Brayshaw FRPS, who's Deputy Chair of the Contemporary Assessment Panel, and he's going to talk about a path through the contemporary distinctions. It should be really fascinating, Richard. But before we start, Richard's asked if we could do a poll. And if you don't mind, I'm going to run a poll, everybody, which basically is asking how many of you, just out of curiosity on the call, have got various distinctions. So I shall set the poll up now and launch it. And what I'd ask you to do, please, is simply tick the box that applies to you. It's all coming in. That's good. And close to getting. I'll leave it just a few more seconds and then I'll stop. Oh, got 48 on. Okay, well, that's a good indication, Richard.
Yeah, thank you. That's interesting.
Can you see it?
I can, yes.
Yeah.
I didn't vote, actually.
Right. Oh. There's Magda coming on. We know the answer as far as she's concerned.
Yes.
Right, I'll end the poll at that point. Thank you, everybody. And I'll close that. Right, Richard, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass on to you. But before I do, I'll be collecting any questions as the session goes on, everybody. If you have any questions for Richard, please put them into the chat panel, and I'll gather the questions together. There will be a couple of natural points in which we can answer or take questions. One is at the end of Richard's introductory session, and the second is after he's gone through a couple of panels with you, one unsuccessful and one successful, and before his closing remarks. So if you would like to put your questions, please, into there, I'll attempt to gather them and ask Richard. So over to you, Richard. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you. I need to, oops, you can't do it in that order. I have to share first, otherwise it won't play.
There we go. That's it.
Okay, so can you see the?
Yes. Yep.
Right, thank you. I've still got the poll actually slap bang in front of me.
Oh, you can close it.
Yes. I have to come out the sharing again. Sorry, otherwise.
Oh, sorry. I thought it had gone. I closed it.
No, let's try. Yeah, presumably you can still see me.
Yeah, I can
see
look
the slides. Good, thank you. Well, yes, thank you. Before I get going, I just want to say a few thank yous. Firstly, to Alan for inviting me to come and speak. To you all for joining. I hope you find it interesting. And particularly a big thank you to Magda Wolner, who has kindly agreed to let me show both of her successful and unsuccessful panels. And I should also say that this represents my views, and I don't speak on behalf of the panel. nor can I predict panel decisions. In fact, the only time a definitive opinion is really expressed by the panel is when we vote on something. And in general, I don't seek to tell anyone who, why, what to photograph. That's entirely up to all of us. Which is interesting, because when I clicked next, nothing happened. Oh, there we go. So a little bit about me to start with. I'm a photographer and artist, and I produce prints for exhibition, and occasionally and hopefully sales at open art exhibitions. I work mainly in series, and my work usually has a conceptual base. A lot of it investigating spaces and how they affect us. Although ultimately, I'm just showing everyone how I see the physical world. Now, my work is intended to be printed 1 to 1.5 meters wide and viewed on a wall. So unfortunately, it doesn't always look its best on a computer screen. But anyway, I don't have a wall handy, so we go with what we've got. So Alan asked me to talk about my work and the contemporary distinctions process. So I was going to go a little bit through my history, my work and process, show you my panel, where I've gone on from there, and talk about assessment and the contemporary distinctions process. So leaping back to the beginning, I've been carrying a camera for an awful long time, and I learned my photographic technique from the books of Ansel Adams. And I started in black and white, had my own darkroom, half of a garage with a not very light-proof curtain across it. I spent a lot of time experimenting with the zone system. My wife certainly got sick of seeing photographs of grey cars. And actually, I think this image, I'm sorry about the copy, was one of the ones I submitted for my L panel, which was over 40 years ago now. And I photographed it, obviously printed it, mounted it myself, handed it over with great trepidation, went along to the assessment. And I suppose I could kindly say it was greeted with total indifference. The comment I remember was, well, I suppose there's no reason not to pass it. So hopefully things have changed a bit since then. So leaping on many, many years, I had various careers, which ended up as a few years as a professional commercial photographer. And somehow I then moved from photographing sunglasses on a light table commercially to doing a course at Farnham University for the Creative Arts called Access to Art and Design. Probably one of the hardest things I've ever done, because this is personal, as you will know, and there's nowhere to hide. I can't disown this and blame the company or the clan or anything. This is me exposing myself in the nicest possible way. And the course encouraged me to be experimental, to be open-minded, and to look more. It's also where I learned how much courage it took me to display my pictures on a wall. Oops, sorry, I pushed the wrong part of the. Yeah, so I had to change the digital fairly early on, because when I was doing commercial work at that time, clients wanted digital, they wanted now. And color labs around me closed, so the nearest 2-hour turnaround color processing lab was in London, which made it a day turnaround. The digital also commercially made sense because you could get clients sign off on the spot by showing them the results. And all my analog equipment went along the way to pay for the digital equipment. But as I was moving from commercial to non-commercial, I was experimenting with straight lines and spaces. And I went on to do a 2-year MA in photography, despite promising my wife I wasn't going to. And this is one of the examples from my degree show. It's actually about 1.5 meters wide, and it's flush mounted on dye bond. And obviously I'm really into spaces. And as you can see, in one sense, it's quite a conceptual piece, and you'll see that conceptual idea in my fellowship panel. More spaces, serious preoccupation with straight lines, and from there, I sometime later submitted a fellowship panel, and I got the associate by exemption because I'd done the MA. So I hadn't really had a lot of experience of the distinction process for many, many years. So I thought what I'd do now is just read you the statement of my panel. I'll run through it without much comment, give you a chance to think about it. And then I'll move on to some work that came after that before we talk about the distinctions themselves. So that was my panel. I would just add that the presentation was around A2 size, flush mounted on card. And as I mentioned in the statement that I showed at the beginning, it was laid out as a brick pattern structure, and the flush mounting on card obviously helped to do that. So fortunately, after forgotten what it was called in those days, resubmission, I think, because there was a couple of images which were not deemed to be up to the standard, I was awarded a fellowship. And obviously the fellowship is a development process. It's a learning process. It can be a scary learning process. But I would encourage you, if you can, to view it as a learning and interesting and fun exercise. I appreciate the result is important, but it is a great opportunity to expand ourselves as we move along through the developing of the work for a submission. This was taken after my fellowship. It was actually exhibited in the Mall Gallery in London in about 2012 at the Discerning Eye Show. And you can still see the obsession with gaps and spaces. And then a few images from external exploration of man-made spaces, and then a few from internal. And these are all photographed in publicly accessible places. I'm not brave enough to clamber through or over fences or break into anything. So most of my work is done in public spaces. And sometimes involves discussions, particularly in London, with security guards who've got CCTV cameras on the outside of their buildings and don't quite understand what I'm doing. But usually they're very nice. Again, you can see divides and separation in the images. One of my influences all through, I guess, my photography has been the Dusseldorf School, founded by the Beckers. Some of you may have heard of them. One of the most famous proponents being Andreas Gursky, who I think was the first photographer to sell an image for $1 million. And his work was enormous, meters wide and high. And so part of his process was the visual experience of just being in front of such an enormous photograph. And partly resonates with my idea of stepping forward and backward as you look at images. I'm moving on to internal spaces now, but sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. I was really honoured because this one was shown at the summer exhibition, the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition in 2016. I think it was a good example of getting the viewer to do some work. I don't really have hard and fast rules about any of what I do or how I do it. But in general, I'm trying to make images which engage the viewer and encourage them to question and use their imaginations. I think viewer participation in an image is quite important, and being able to stretch imaginations is, for me, I find it a very rewarding result when somebody comes up with something even I haven't seen. And also you'll note from most of my work that the compositions tend to be very formal. I'm a sucker for straight lines. And these are a few of my internal spaces. was on a roll at that point because, much to my amazement, this one was exhibited at the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition in 2017. And again, hopefully it leaves something to the viewer's imagination, but it also has, for me, the strong formal composition. And I do respond to straight lines, as you can tell. In terms of what I'm trying to do, I can't tell anybody what to see in my images. I wouldn't even try to. I can only show and suggest. And I think it was Roland Barthes who proposed the idea that an artwork is composed of three parts: the work itself, the artist, and the viewer. And I'm a great believer in that approach. It means that each work is unique for each viewer, because we all bring our own world, our cultural backgrounds, and our experiences to bear on everything we look at. And again, playing to the idea of the viewer using imagination, our imaginations are all different because of our history and culture. This one is from a short series called Abyss. It's actually shown in an online version of The Discerning Eye in 2020. Even when there's a lot of bottles involved, I've still got straight lines everywhere. And this is its partner. So I sometimes show this as a diptych, the idea that one leads to the other. You go from the fancy world of the upmarket hotel bar to the reality on a London street. Just to prove that I don't always do straight lines, this was from a site responsive project I did with a group which I helped found called 6+2. The project was called Hold. We were given access to an old police station, and each of us responded in different ways. We had painting, sculpture, photographer, video, and the result was made into a photo book. But we were also able to hold an exhibition in the same space. And it was fascinating to see people's reactions. This is also one of the few times I've used Photoshop to create a composite. But hopefully you can see something about the sense of being behind the walls and dreaming of escape. I included this because it allows me to talk about the sort of process I use. It's called serendipity. I'm also part of a group of artists, writers, painters, and photographers who set each other tasks or subjects to respond to. And we get together at the moment, unfortunately online, but such is the world, to show each other the results, read it aloud, or painting or photographic images. One of the topics that came up was serendipity. Now, I had no clue how to respond to serendipity. And so part of my normal approach is just to go out and look around me and respond to what I see. But because there's something in my head, there's a germ of an idea sometimes, that without me really realizing drives me in a particular direction. And I would never have taken this photograph under normal circumstances, but somehow it seemed to perfectly fit serendipity. So in general, I'm around with my camera with some sense of an idea, but the photography is very much intuitive. I just photograph what I respond to and what I react to. And then the body of work tends to reveal itself during the editing process. So that as I look at what I've done, I sometimes realize what I've done. And so it can evolve. And of course, my idea can evolve with it as the images show things to me which I haven't seen. And in general, I'm looking at spaces, obviously, because that's what I talked about. So that brings us to an opportunity for questions. I don't know if there are, might be some.
Just the one so far, Richard, and it was, given the scale of your images, do you use a larger format camera?
Actually, well, I've been chasing megapixels, as you might imagine, but not on an unlimited budget. So um, I I tended to use around 40 megapixel sensors when I could get them in the traditional 35 millimeter format. So, and I find they will quite happily blow up to that size without any particular difficulties, because of course our viewing is related to the distance we are from the work, and the bigger the work, the further back we have to be in order to take it all in. So
Mm.
it's been enough for me. And there might be some discussions if I showed any interest in medium or large format or medium format. And these are all digital images that I'm showing, apart from the first one from the L panel.
Yeah, it is interesting, this idea of the viewing distance, because many of us are in clubs and we're used to judges going up to within an inch of your image and going, oh, I can see noise in this picture, whereas from a normal viewing distance, you can't.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would hope that people are looking at the image, not the pixels. Um,
Yes.
the message is in the image, not in, well, apart from some photographers who work digitally that way, the message is in the image and not in the pixels.
Yeah. I've got a few more questions coming in now. Uh, how would you explain the difference between serendipity and beachcombing?
Ah, I don't know if I can actually. Um, uh, to me, I suppose they're quite similar. At least I would interpret beachcombing as out looking and wondering and prodding at things and seeing what's there, um, which is what I do. I suppose the serendipity came in the sense that I came across something, but in one sense, they're both the same process. We're out exploring and questioning and looking and wondering.
Yeah. Fine. And then typical, sort of a technical question. Do you use a tripod or a tilt and shift, or is everything handheld?
Um, Most now is handheld, actually. I have got tilt and shift lens, and one of the images that I showed you with the fence with the buildings in the background, which was blocks of color, was done with a tilt and shift lens, but it was handheld. If I don't have too much coffee before I start photographing, I can usually handhold with the image stabilization, which seems to be reasonably good, at least for me these days.
Mm. Yeah.
And so I don't like to be too intrusive or obvious. And of course, I mentioned security guards in London, but they don't take kindly to tripods either. Uh, so I try to not use them if I can avoid it. And I find that sensors are, at least for my purposes, are good enough these days to be able to print what I want,
Mm.
even with reasonably high ISOs, but handheld.
And that was my question. Do you have your own printer, or do you send them away?
No, I have my own printer. I at least up to A2 size. Larger than that, I have to send away. I did have a studio in which I had an A1 printer, but that was a while ago. But I suppose I've inherited from the black and white darkroom do-it-yourself tradition. And maybe partly because I'm a control freak. I want to be in control of the process. I want to be able to control all the results, and so I just naturally print them as well.
Yeah, I know. I sympathize with that. A question about one particular image. Was the grey wall image a composite of different images? That's the one in the police station. You see, he says, I seemed to recognize a C at the bottom, or do you not, or don't you manipulate your images?
It was one of the very rare that I do. It was actually a composite of two images. The wall was the wall of the prison cell, and I can't remember where the sea was taken. Actually, it might have been off the Devon coast, but I'm not 100% sure. Um, yes, it was a combination of the two because I was trying to evoke that sense of dreaming of escape.
Thank you very much. Oh, one more. Uh, what comes first? Again, it's from the question about serendipity and beachcombing. What comes first? Do you generate your ideas via serendipity, or uh, ge- or or generate the process of serendipity and the final result? I'm not quite sure what that.
No, I think actually this one was unusual in that the subject was serendipity, but normally um, ideas come from all over the place. Sometimes they come from photographing. I've found if they get completely stuck and I don't know what to do, going out to photograph something is actually quite a good way of discovering. And sometimes I get a photograph that I wouldn't have imagined finding, which takes me down another path. And so I would say the serendipity was the coming across something just by wondering and looking. And I have a habit of disappearing down alleyways and things to see what's down there. Or sometimes the start points come from reading, or from work of other photographers or other artists. I do tend to spend a lot of time in art galleries, well, when I could. And sometimes that provides inspiration or an idea of something that might be explored with photography. So they come from all over the place. And as I say, as the project evolves, so the idea becomes more concrete and specific. But I find if I start too strictly, I blind myself because I've stopped looking and I stop responding.
Thank you very much. I think can we move on then to your next set of images, Richard?
Yeah, sure. So the contemporary distinctions process. Photography that communicates a visual realization of a stated argument, idea, or concept. And I suppose we would summarize that as a point of view, having something you want to say. And actually, when I look at the contemporary group definition, photography that conveys ideas, stimulates thought, and encourages interpretation, photographs about rather than of, I would say that I see those two statements as harmonious and additive, really. It's all about conveying something. And I think about rather than of is a good summary of what I'm trying to do with my work. And I also think you can't do exact definitions because the world won't fit into them. So we need some flexibility. So the criteria, I've summarized these. The full words are on the website, obviously. The statement, purpose, aims, and objectives. And I think as projects evolve towards panel, the statement can evolve as well. What I was saying about my work and letting things grow, I think equally applies to this. I think it's important to start with some idea, something, and let it develop. I must say that it's very rare that we have a panel made up of what somebody thought was their best pictures that is recommended, because typically it doesn't have the cohesion or the vision which we're looking for. So I think starting from something as an idea is a good basis. And then the aims and objectives, I would say, is if the purpose is your message, what you want to say, the aims and objectives are how you're going to say it photographically. And the reason this is all important is because when we start an assessment, we look at the statement and we ask ourselves, do we understand it? And is it clear to us? And that question, have you done then what you said you were going to do, forms the basis of a lot of the assessment. So if we don't understand it or it's not clear, we can't really do the rest of our work. So it is quite an important step along the way. I also find it's very helpful when you do the editing and selecting, because every image you can ask the question, how does this relate to my statement? How does this relate to what I said I was going to do? We're also looking for cohesion, in that the work must sit together. It must look like it's from the same person in a consolidated group of images. So that tends to mean the style is consistent, the way of working is consistent for the panel, and also the criteria of communicating individuals' vision and understanding is a significant place that the photography comes out, the photographer. This is where you see what the photographer's vision is, how they see the world and how they see the communication of their message. And again, we have to determine whether that's been achieved or not. And all through this, it's not up to us to agree or disagree with what's being done. I think the only disagreement about a process would be if it was illegal. If the statement was advocating something illegal, I think there'd be words said about it. I don't think it would even get to us. But in general terms, it's not up to us to say this statement, this idea, this way of communicating, we don't like, and therefore we won't recommend. Our personal likes and dislikes have got nothing to do with this. High or highest for the fellowship level of technical ability using techniques and practices appropriate to the subject. And I think the word appropriate is very important. We try to look at the way a message has been communicated technically, the photographer using their skills to get a message across. And sometimes that can involve grain or blur or movement or different color balance. It doesn't have to be technically correct. It has to get its message across. Although obviously, because it's a photographic distinction, we have to be mindful of good technique, but appropriate technique. And appropriate craft and artistic presentation, I interpret, apart from the skill to balance a panel, I interpret that as a way of getting your message across. The way you put your panel together gives you another opportunity to communicate your message. So it's not about simply does the color balance, does the contrast balance, does the lines all point in from the outside. It's a way of saying, how do I get my message across by the way I'm going to present my work? And for a fellowship panel, obviously we're looking for distinctive. And to some degree, distinctive depends on your point of view and your message. But it's something that will, in various ways, take our attention, stick with us, draw us in, engage us, involve us in some way. Because the statement, your point of view will be a personal point of view, and you would hope that we would be engrossed in your point of view and drawn in. And that's all ways in which the panel can be defined as distinctive. I was going to go on to the next slide then, but it's decided it doesn't want to. Sorry, I have to come out of the screen share a second and go on to the next one. So I felt very honoured and privileged when I was asked to join the panel. I get to see and think about some fascinating, engaging, imaginative and skillful work. And during the one-to-one sessions, people entrust me with ideas, fears, experiments, because this is all a very personal process. And I think all the way through it, the role of the assessor, in my view, is to help and encourage photographers achieve their aims while keeping the standards up. Because I think we all want the standards to be high. But it's all about helping people achieve that. It's not about preventing people achieving that. I think it's quite important. So, oops. Another thank you to Magda Wollner for letting me do this. Magda had a fellowship panel which was not recommended, and then we had further one-to-one and discussion, and Magda put in a subsequent panel which was recommended. So what I'm going to do is show you the statement and the first panel, and I'll go through the first panel without comment, and maybe you might think about, if you were the assessor, what would you do? And then we'll talk a bit about what we discussed in one-to-one and in evolution of the panel. I'll read this one out because it's slightly blurry, I think. A moment for humanity. Auschwitz needs little introduction. Growing up in Poland, it loomed large in the minds of family and friends. I managed my feelings by blocking it out, all the time knowing that the horrors should never be forgotten. My heart and body felt heavy with sadness, just utter disbelief at the atrocities carried out there. The railway platform was the end of the line. Stepping off, people became only numbers. It's hard to walk up and down the well-worn stairs without walking in the shoes of so many that had perished in this place. I also think about the person who spent all night engraving a message in German on one of the bricks, "Which pig brought me to Auschwitz?" My personal challenge was to face my demons and produce a photographic response. Over the course of numerous visits, I found myself drawn to the silhouettes, reflections and shadows of other visitors. They came to represent not only the living ghosts of those who lived and died in the camp, but also modern-day bystanders who witness atrocities but take no action. Auschwitz reminds us how easily the thin layer of humanity can be stripped away, how life is fragile and delicate, like a leaf. I am disappointed by the disrespectful behaviours of the younger generation who are vandalising the walls just to leave a trivial memo with no thought about the poignant messages from the past. In my panel, I've woven a hard and imagined reality that combines the camp today with a living past. Today, we still have reasons to worry as international cooperation fails to address extreme evil, civil war, hunger, disaster, human exploitation, and genocide. I want to remind everyone that we need to change our behaviour to improve the future. And this is the Magda's first panel. And the hanging plan, I apologise, I've slightly changed the aspect ratios in the process of sticking onto this slide. But as you can see, it's basically 3 rows of 7 images. So that was Magda's first panel, which wasn't recommended, as I said. And this is part of the feedback that was provided after the assessment. So in general, the submission meets its aims and objectives, however, it does not always do this. There are 2 main areas of concern, those of style and consistency. The vision is strongly expressed with some consistent details, such as faces or figures glimpsed through windows or as reflections or shadows like ghosts, images 1, 7, and 15, for example. This adds empathy and emotion to a bleak and dark scene. However, the panel does show two different styles, one with multiple layers, such as numbers I won't bother with, and one of single images. This is problematic in terms of the criteria. In technical terms, the compositions were generally well thought out with good use of viewpoints and reflections. Images 16 and 17, however, are a good example of the inconsistency. One is strong and has contrast, the other is flatter and does not. Images 12 and 14 being another example. The reuse of the glasses in image 20 is beginning to seem repetitive. Concern was also expressed about the large black areas in some images with no detail at all. The panel considered the way forward for this work is to address the inconsistency of treatment and technique because many of the other aspects of the panel show empathy and vision. So Magda did with enthusiasm. And so we had another one-to-one. And in terms of the one-to-one, I'd encourage anyone thinking of submitting for a distinction to take advantage of this. It's a great way to find out how your work relates to the standards and discuss ways forward. And in fact, you have, for those that you don't know, that you have three opportunities on a project, really. One, to talk about the statement, and then two, to talk about the evolving panel. So I would suggest the statement discussion is fairly early. The first panel discussion in relation to the statement is not at the end, and the second one is nearing the end, because that way you get to calibrate progress and also possibly change direction if you think it might become more useful. So now the FRPS. And I'll talk to these images because these show the progress. When Magda and I had the one-to-one, with questioning, we identified the two key aspects of this panel were Magda's emotional response and the indifference of the people there and people in society, as the statement said. So there is revised statement. Auschwitz needs little introduction. Growing up in Poland, it loomed large in the minds of family and friends. I managed my feelings by blocking it out, all the time knowing that the horrors should never be forgotten. I was afraid to visit this devilish place, afraid of what I would see there and how it would affect me. Auschwitz reminds us how easily the thin layer of humanity can be stripped away, so I set myself the personal challenge of facing my demons to produce a photographic response. Over several years and numerous visits, I found myself drawn to the silhouettes, reflections, shapes and shadows of visitors. For me, they came to represent not only the living ghosts of those who lived and died in the camp, but also modern-day bystanders who witness atrocities and take no action. Unfortunately, we still have reasons to worry today as international cooperation fails to address extreme evil, civil wars, disrespect for race, colour, religion, hunger, human exploitation and genocide. Hatred, xenophobia and intolerance towards others is rampant, slowly poisoning humanity. In my panel, I have woven a hard and imagined reality that combines the camp today with the living past. I want to show the past and present to remind everyone we need to change our behaviour to improve the future. The future is already here. It is alive and grows in our intentions, in our choices, in our indifference and inability to react, to help. We delude ourselves that it is wars, catastrophes or pandemics that are changing the world. It is our indifference that causes the greatest number of victims. Let's overcome our fear of the unknown. Let's build bridges. Let's celebrate our diversity because we're actually more connected than divided. Everything depends on us. And so from that statement, when looking at the images, we picked out the key of using the silhouettes and the people in modern day dress who were in the camp, not really taking much notice necessarily of the camp, but not always. And this was the layout panel. And this really highlights my statement that the panel is another way of conveying your message. This is a 1-10-10 layout, and the top image emphasizes the personal. I think it's a very clever way of showing what a personal project this is. You have a semi-silhouette and reflection of the camp is at the heart of the viewer. So in one image, we've summarized the personal nature of this project. which meets the criteria. And then there are images showing the aspects of the camp, but always, now I think I'm right in saying always, there will be a silhouette, shadow, or some body looming in the image, which there wasn't always in the images before. Even here, I don't know if you can see it, but there are people lurking in the shadows there. And there is a powerful and emotive message from the volume of shoes. And again, a modern day transaction in such a setting. And you'll notice the style is almost always now slightly muted. We don't have the bright contrasts of some of the previous images, the highlighted leaf against the fence, because it didn't fit with the message in the statement. And that's not to criticize individual images. The question is, how does it relate to my statement, as I said before? Here we've got a stronger image, but again, you've got somebody pondering, and the white of the window is quite symbolic in a way, looking into a future or looking at something coming. Again, there's an engagement of the viewer. And again, in relation to the statement, that single face in the small section of window says a lot about the people there. But again, this is not a high contrast, sunny, bright image. It's quite soft and muted, and all the reflections add to a blur and a haze, which again is part of the history disappearing. Again, we've got sunshine, but we've also got people in modern dress contrasted against the images on the wall of some of the people who were imprisoned there. Again, there's layers in this image. It's consistent in style, and the person in the photograph isn't really taking a lot of notice of the surroundings. Very interesting seeing, because that picture on the wall is looking at one of the viewers wearing a mask. So it makes it very contemporary and relates it to what was going on at the time. And here again, the same technique. This one is slightly brighter, but it still fits within the idea of the silhouettes and the shadows and the depth which those give in terms of looking back. And there is still one figure in the camp, in the light. And again, it's similar style. To my mind, this image meets the criteria particularly because of those sunglasses. That makes that person modern and looking away, which again reinforces the message. And again, we have silhouettes, but also a view of the camp. And again, we have layers which take us back through time. And again, a very interesting vision. Again, it's not bright, it's not sunny, it's dull, it's muted, and there is one modern person just in that window, making us insignificant in comparison to what happened in the camp. Again, here we have the modern people with their modern umbrellas and their modern dress, looking at a dull, drab setting. So again, all the images are consistent in style, and the vision is always using these layers and depth in order to highlight the contrast between the history and the modern viewer. And for balance, there is somebody looking, praying in that camp. So clearly taking on board what has happened, and maybe with personal experience, I don't know. But again, you've got the layers of history and the muted palette, the lack of contrast, all adding to the sense of looking back through time. And each time the images are also showing us something of the camp, while still embodying that relationship between the camp and the modern viewer. And to my mind, that this image creates an interesting dialogue with the statement, because the person on the left, that's almost on the extreme left, that's almost an accusing stare, which triggers a lot of thought processes. But the other people obviously have got masks. They're talking to each other, not particularly looking at the camp. And we have the same technique of those people being picked out in windows or spaces within the context and framework of the physical structures. And again, one person, yet we still get the overwhelming sense of the role of the camp and the significant aspects of some of the structures. Again, silhouettes and modern people in that context. And one modern person set against barbed wire and the idea of destruction. And you've got the watchtowers. So again, the photographic seeing, the vision, meets the criteria, and also it very well conveys the message which was defined in the statement. And that was Magda's. This was my current favourite image of mine. This is part of an Edgeland series, because I've been confined to where I live roughly. Couldn't walk very far, so I had to take my ideas and my camera into the neighbourhood, and I would never have imagined that walking into a sort of drain pipe would have produced this. So a very stark leap from Magda's panel to the last of my images. So thank you very much for listening. And Alan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. I apologise earlier for my internal phone call ringing. We haven't got too many questions. We've only got one, and it's about Magda's panel. It says some photos seem more contrasty and some more muted. Is this okay in a panel?
Yes, in the second panel, yes, because they weren't dramatically contrasty, and the contrast wasn't playing a significant role in the interpretation of the images. It was obviously we can't be absolute about these things, and they were all within the same sense of a muted lighting, a lack of deep black and brightness, which conveyed more of the sense set out in the statement. So yes, there is some scope. We don't require exactly the same, and you can see even from the other images I showed, although the statement talked about people's indifference, there was at least one where the person was anything but indifferent. So it adds another layer within the interpretation of the statement and conveying of the message.
Thank you very much. Any more questions? None coming through on chat? I think that's about all. If you could stop sharing then, Richard, if you don't mind.
Yes. I can get my mouse to do its thing. Sorry, I clicked on the wrong thing.
No, I did. It was, I was trying to share my screen and something had moved. So, going, what? Yes, mine decided to go into that.
Enjoy technology.
Absolutely. So, Richard, thank you so much, and that's been very enlightening. Given me a lot of thought about what I want to do next. And you and I have talked about that. Must still put my one-to-one so other people can take note. It was very timely advice for us all, I think. So thank you, Richard. That was fascinating. It was illuminating. Thanks to Magda, particularly, for allowing us to see the two aspects of our work, the panel that didn't quite work and the one that did. I think that was very brave of you, Magda, so thank you. And before I close tonight, just an invitation. Next month, we've got a complete contrast. We've got Abby Trader-Smith, and interestingly, she'll be talking about two projects, or one major project rather, and one assignment. and her project was to follow, it was called On Obesity, and it follows a young woman from the age of 10 to adulthood, and her response to her obesity. And the other section is going to be about a recent assignment she did with Greenpeace, where she was in the Antarctic. So completely different views of the world, but it'll be a very interesting talk, and that's on the 16th of August, and event registration is now available, and we've got quite a few already signed up for that. So thanks to everybody who asked questions. Thank you all for attending. We've had as many as 60 on the call at any one point, and our recording will be available on the RPS YouTube channel in the next few weeks. So thank you once again, Richard.
Thank you. Well, thank you everybody for listening.
And thank you everybody, and good night from me. I shall stop sharing.